In the pentagram rite, I saw pink streaks. With the first set of vibrations, I saw little orange spheres. And no, they were not the pumpkins one sees here. And they were about the size of eggs. I don't know how many there were in the room. There was a breeze that went through me, from my ears up and my feet. And I don't mean the sensation of a typical, oh, you felt the breeze. I mean, I could feel it go through me. I saw in the fifth set of vibrations, a lavender mist fill this light fixture here. In the fourth, it was like there was a darkness that filled up the south to the point where past this edge was obscured by the darkness. With the third, I felt the presence behind me. With the second, there was a moment where red was seen, and that was about it. In the final reading, a sense of weightlessness hit, and there was an odd, warm feeling. And amongst this odd, warm feeling was the pain and the stiffness and all that just went away. And I was filled with a peculiar sense of awareness, almost like another side of the poems going on. And in the final scrying, I saw rainbow colors, each separate, and not in a sequence of the rainbow or anything like that, but it was like it was some big net going through the air. It wasn't exactly even. Some of it was up here, some of it was further up, some was further down, but it wasn't like it was straight angle up. And I was hit with 5 sets of analgesic scours and left kind of throbby and tinkly. And to show what the fixture is like with its lights on, we have this. And so you see the phenomena that I was talking about is much stronger, and it differs from the lights. Fawn connects us to a Celtic current that seems to go outside of what we're taught in church. A spoil sport is an example of suffering. Not suffering because things are difficult, but because of a focus on taking account and pointing things out. The shivering beggar reminds me of the sort of thing that I have many times had to deal with. People just presume you're cold, and that's not what's going on. It's good if people are helpful in that direction, usually, but, being cold may not have anything to do with such issues. But of course, one of the things that pushed the charitable person on was, well, let's see what it takes for this person to be grateful. Now, sometimes gratitude is inner, and whether it was needed or whatever the case was, anybody who's helped me, I've always been grateful for it. I may not have expressed it outwardly, or I may not have stated it in the detail that would have satisfied some people, but I'm grateful nonetheless, past, present, and future. Jonah connects us to a sense that brings in some of Job, doesn't it? And the Near Eastern idea of Lotan, an entity of the West. John Skelton reminds us that although we may know or use some things from a different culture, we are in the culture that we are in. I wonder what it feels like to be drowned. Isn't as suicidal as the title. What it actually addresses is being fully immersed or overwhelmed in a certain state of affairs. Double Red Daisies comes off like a song because part of it repeats. And how people have a signature move. I'd love to be a fairy's child. Kind of gets into more physical fantasies about what non-physical beings are. Well, they're physical in their own dimension, right? Fire beings, and if there's light beings, well, the light beings are, if the reference is to light beings, then the light beings are, again, of their own dimension. And, there is an objectiveness to that. But, the subjects are taken, the subjective is taken too literally sometimes, and people, literally expect to live with fairies in a physical sort of world of fantasy. Another war, in a way, refers to the state of how things are. Started off, handful of people fighting a handful of people, and it's worked its way up. It's like there's a competition to be remembered for, the war. And now people say, well, it's not war if the other side isn't properly armed and they're trying to genocide them. It's like, it is, but it's definitely not what you'd call a just war. Strong beer reminds of, there being better times for certain things. And knowing that some of those things are not good for one and kind of can lead to problems. And more we know that, for example, honestly, the 3 most common drugs that people use, these 3 drugs all lead to shorter lives and various health issues. Now, this on average. You don't necessarily know that somebody will not live as long if they smoke or drink or use caffeine, but they do certainly factor into things, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because, this isn't a medical channel, but we do kind of regard what our health might be, right? Marigolds remind us of plants beyond, the importance of that plant itself. And perhaps how certain plants bring out something in someone. Love and black magic is definitely one of those things that seems very connected, right? Because if you read those spells where people are either, even worshiping objects and their beloved and all that, they, it's about love, most of it, relationships and all that, which happens to relate to some of the verses that I use, right? Because one of the examples of the evil magic is the that about relationships. Smoke rings reminds us of our tendency to find patterns. A child's nightmare reminds us that our ideas and our experiences in childhood blend with those of the adult, or they presage that. I certainly saw things when I was young that I semi-remember now, and it more relates to what I became, even though I didn't expect that. A boy in church reminds us that we all may not get it, or sometimes we do get it, and that's why we're not going to church anymore. Corporal stare reminds us of those automatic moments and expectations and possibilities that are still difficult to deal with when they come about. The assault heroic reminds us that what we go through, even if we didn't go to war like him, is our opportunity for a heroic life, whether we're conscious of it at the time or not. Phoenix Flame is one of those things that, well, you know, the Phoenix myth that it burns itself and then it starts over. It's like, but what if the breakdown and start again, sort of a black alchemy? It's not just the physical forms you have to deal with, it's the internal forms. Catherine Drury reminds us that we don't know what people are thinking or how the experience was for others, and we need to be careful about our assumptions when reacting with others. I have witnessed people that just accuse people of lying. I've dealt with that quite a bit, that they accuse them of lying. If they don't know, they don't remember, so therefore they're just going to accuse people of lying, and that's not how it should work. Or there's other issues that people can come about because they're just, trying to fill in the blanks. The treasure box relates to different types of things that are approached and sort of collected in the same way. Whether the kiss is metaphorical or literal, there is that seemingly insignificant thing that becomes significant because of someone else. Lost love can kind of warn you about living in the past. Now, a certain level of connection or whatever, perhaps, there's a mistake you made and you need to deal with that mistake. But, there's things about some of that stuff, like going back and, people 50 years ago, I could have done this. It's like, well, you don't know how it would have turned out. You really actually don't. Fox's Dingle takes us through different seasons, and that's how our love of others should be. It shouldn't be about one particular season, which, it helps to know somebody for more than just one segment of the moon, for example. Mirror, mirror is, again, one of those types of magic that people perform. And rather than let anything answer, if it's usually your own subconscious, if anything, but things can influence your subconscious. A frosty night reminds us that when unexpected or unusual swings in environment or whatever happen, to find the appreciation in it, find the connection to other things in it. Dicky is a reminder that, hey, we are alive. So let's focus on what we can do while we're alive. Three drinkers had different tasks in life, but they all appreciated each other's accomplishments. Perhaps you can say that's implied. The boy out of church reminds us of some of the stuff that Jesus had to deal with, according to the Bible, in terms of the conservatives. And there was a person in Portland, Oregon, who was offering $1 million reward to show a change of the Sabbath from sunset of Friday to sunset of Saturday to Sunday. Other than that thing of believing and obeying whoever's in charge of you, but other than that, anything that supported that change in the Sabbath from the Bible. Of course, there is no such thing. That's why he could mention it. And with digital searches, it can make a person more confident about putting such challenges out there. After the play reminds you that when it comes to entertainment, well, there's real life events that are happening and going on that maybe you don't realize until after you step away from the entertainment. And some people get very upset about the whole TV stuff, and it's like that stuff is going on regardless, and just blasting the volume of the television, just, that's just stuff that's going to come back. And that's an undercurrent. So the problem isn't that, somebody wants you to turn down or off the TV during a conversation, or you have to go step away and do something that doesn't involve the TV, or whatever the thing may be. Escapism, just, it's going to be there when you return, if not worse. One hard look, well, certain gestures can make all the difference, whether for good or bad, a well-placed one. True Johnny reminds us to mean what we say. The voice of Beauty Drowned is an experience of being immersed in the situation. The God called poetry reminds of the saying of Prophet Muhammad that mentions that in some poetry there is evil magic, and why in the Bible there's condemnation of philosophy. Well, the New Testament writers obviously had pre-Socratic, Socratic, Aristotelian, Platonic philosophy going through them, Stoic, Epicurean, particularly from the forms of hedonism, but there was a lot of stuff going through there. So obviously they did philosophy, but they wanted to ban it for everybody else. But that sort of poem reminds you why. And also in some of the Vedic literature, some of the heights of referring to deity as the transcendent yet operating everything, but some of the forms and stories kind of, that's thrown in there is often something to say, don't take it literally, or, it goes beyond that, so take it literally, but, it's the best represent, but it can get confusing when we try to personify. Rocky Acres reminds us of how one environment or one effect upon a people can come off differently for them than it does for others. Advice to Lovers contains something that I have been mentioning, and it's like, okay, don't criticize for an emotion or a feeling. Beliefs and actions, yeah, sure, but Nebuchadnezzar's fall definitely reminds of the story of Daniel in the Bible, and it's pretty traditional in its interpretation. But I wonder if we're referring to something here well, I mean, there, that refers to a sort of shamanism, or perhaps some symbolic lesson about the character of him rather than trying to relate an event. And yes, I've said elsewhere that at least 1,000 years before, there already was a tradition about Daniel. So Daniel was recast in a different time. Now, there's people with the same name in different periods, and that's possible, but there's just too much to the old Daniel stuff that indicates that, just like a lot of the Bible, that it's a rewrite from what the people of Epila and some other Mesopotamian cultures did. And no, I know Epila is in modern Palestine and all that, or at Palestine, Jordan, whatever, Sham, as they would call it in Arabic. Give us rain. Well, there's difficulty sometimes in getting what you want, but definitely there are required prices to pay, and some people will not be stopped in their celebration. Ali reminds us of the difference of engagement in the situation. Loving Henry reminds us that we love even though we don't agree. Brittle Bones is an appreciation after the fact of youth and realizing your limits. There's no shame in limits, or at least there shouldn't be. Apples and Water reminds of that in my time of dying song, because you're thinking of, well, I did somebody some good once, right? I must have done somebody some good. And I've refrained from singing it. Manticore in Arabia. It's referring to the Welsh, right? But it also can make you think of the forces that have united against Arabia. And I include governments that have taken over the country and, put certain movements before their own people. I mean, always have, because we're in the third version of that kingdom, right? Outlaws reminds us that even the criminals have stuff to fulfill, right? And the sides that they break the rules of aren't necessarily the moral or ethical authorities anyways. I mean, they control society, but you know what I mean. Balulu Virginie reminds us sometimes breaking away from our parents is best, but then again, the parents do like the return, or the prodigal child may return. Hawk and Buckle reminds us, of the summertime difficulties, but if you figure out how to get by, you figure out how to get by. Alice Jean reminds you of the Little Mermaid, doesn't it? But right there, present, particularly before television, was the myth that you could be reminded of in your life. The cupboard reminds us of what we've collected for the future. The beacon reminds us that the animals and the objects may have similar goals or similar skills. Pot and kettle reminds us of relationships that seem as serious as a moth to a flame. A haunted house is mentioning of December, and certainly the darker time of year is a time that can bring up a lot of that, because it's cold, spending more time inside, the nights are longer, etc., etc. Neglectful Edward reminds us that people want tokens of our journeys. Some of us tell tales, some of us bring things back. The well-dressed children gets us to think, are we doing things out of pride and pomp? But then again, there's the idea of one's best. But the highest sense of one's best is to put on your nicer clothes, get up in the middle of the night, do a ritual, prayer, etc., etc. And then, don't wear your, work clothes per se to the place of worship either. So it's a balance. Thunder at night reminds us of primal fears and group reactions. Wild strawberries reminds us to know how to use what's there and not overstate ourselves and not deprive ourselves of art either. Jane personifies forces of nature. Vain and careless takes us to remembrance of doing things in ourselves regardless of who may be watching. Is vain and careless the one, or is it the other? Or some combination of both? 9 o'clock reminds you of how obsessions can affect your sleep cycles. The picture book reminds us that there is supposed to be sort of an open thing, like to whole pictures, right? It's supposed to be more than your imagination. TV has more or less ruined that. Of course, we can pick up tarot cards or whatever and know just because you shove the deck a certain way doesn't mean that it's, has to be determinative or whatever in that sort of way. I'm just thinking of that as an example. The Promised Lullaby reminds us that when we're called to express, as we said we could, trying helps. Because you can't always memorize or come up with something. Of course, there's certain formulas that are better than mere art, but haunted reminds me of the physical connection to the seeing of the dead and memories and stuff like this. Like if your temporal parietal lobe, where that meets, if there's a odd reduction in activity, you can have flashbacks, you can have, it'll be like you're encountering the dead, and it can even be interactive. But then again, the memory, the legacy, and the energy related to those who have passed on is present all over the place. The Jests of the Clock reminds me of something that I wrote for a sermon, and this was about the identifying and connecting to and dedicating your connection or identification or understanding of something to divinity. And that's usually not how it goes for people. Usually the reference goes and something happens and it's like, oh, it's almost like it's mocking you because it's doing its thing, and it's like it's a clock, dude. Here They Lie probably talks about soldiers, how they knew what they were up against. Tom Taylor can refer to the disturbing nature of music, or perhaps the powerful nature of music. Country at War reminds us that that sort of thing isn't just for one person, it's like for everybody. Saucepan Fuck reminds of how stuff goes on while other stuff goes on. Of course, I like to symbolize the food and stuff like this when I can, because it's just, an extra little mental devotion you can do. And whenever you smell the thing, that's, the meaning that you put to that. The leveler, well, there are leveling experiences like dying, but it does remind you how you shouldn't die. Hate not, fear not, reminds us that that sort of thing doesn't make a difference with some stuff, so you can step aside with that reaction. A rhyme of friends is something that's much rarer nowadays, is those long-term, lifelong friendships. And sometimes what people need is company. People need our company. A first review reminds us that it's certain parts that make the whole for some. The stake is a tracing out of thought about where a weapon came from. The troll's nosegay is that even in illness, there can be something to be gleaned from it. And perhaps there's going to be a cure. The pier glass reminds of, scrying. That if you look at things, you can start to dream and you get into a state, and that makes you more open to other entities that may want to enact with you, and maybe you become aware. But it's not so willed as people think, because I will it. It's not that simple. The finding of love reminds us of the stepping aside that happens, like automatically, when certain things are brought about. Reproach reminds us that even if something's tradition, it doesn't make it right. There's more to that poem than that. Magical picture, like particularly the old house that I am, outside of this room, nearby, is, something could be found, and that could bring up all sorts of memories, and maybe the experience is that follow and stuff will not be good. Maybe they will. Maybe they'll eventually be settled. Distant smoke is one of those things, like, because people write biblical fiction and the Bible doesn't have much details about stuff, so they talk about other stuff. And I don't think that Robert Graves was claiming that he has like the extra biblical story or anything. He was just making a point about the aftermath of certain experiences with the whole Cain and Abel thing and being your own person, which may result in your parents not taking your side. Raising the stone, the fire for men and stones is how that's talked about. So obviously you don't want to be, per se, a stone in that sense. The gnat comes off like one of those horror movies, right? Exaggerations about, the insects. You definitely want to live without some of these insects around you, particularly in your home. The patchwork bonnet, definitely even the title gets you to the idea of survival. And there's the reminder of modesty and myth beyond the church myth. Kit Logan and Lady Helen reminds us that even though we may have done stuff that is not going to be approved of by some organizations and such, we may still have to approach. Of course, the example here is the church, and now people don't have to approach the church with their unwanted kids. I mean, that does happen.